So here I am. I'm in a room and we ran a great activity. I mean, it was just lots of energy. Everybody was totally into it. Lots of positive nonverbals, high fives. Excellent. So the activity ends, and while everybody was participating at a very high level, and then they watch a trainer say, "All right, so let's move on. Next, we're going to learn about." And so there was absolutely nothing that attached or connected what that activity really was all about to the content that the activity was supposed to give people confidence about. So this is really an opportunity for us to talk and learn about the importance of debriefs. Because the activity creates the experience, but the debrief creates the learning. And so they were talking about why that step gets skipped and exactly how to run one that earns its place in your session. Welcome to the Let's Skill Up training table, everybody. I'm Charles Fellingham. I'm joined by Karie Alberon, and we're the co-founders of Let's Skill Up. And today we're talking about the most under-designed 5 minutes in most training sessions, the debrief.
The debrief. I've seen this a million times. I've experienced it a million times. And when we ask the question, why does this happen? Why do we oftentimes skip the debrief? It boils down to a few things. One, of course, is time, right? And as trainers, we want to prioritize and maximize the time in our discussions and our activities. We find more value out of that. It's more fun to do those things. So oftentimes we can get into the time trap there. And then I think the other big one that the other big root cause is we tend to forget the importance of the debrief. Just like you said, Charles, the activity itself, the discussions, whatever we do as the substance of the session, that is the opportunity to build the experience itself. But the debrief is really where that translation from the training world to their real world happens. And if that translation does not happen, then all of this time, all of this effort, all of this planning that we put into place to build this perfect activity, it runs the risk of going to waste. So when we think about a few key traps or common traps that we can fall into as trainers, I think a handful of them, and Charles, I'm curious to hear your thoughts here too, but a handful that I know of are treating the debrief as a formality, as a general stamp of kind of approval, right? A check the box. Questions like, any thoughts? Or how did this land? And we're giving participants very little to go on to actually build a substantive conversation and build that translation from, again, our training world to their real world. Any other common traps that you know of,
Yeah,
Charles?
debriefing the process instead of really connecting to the learning. How did that feel? We should be in a debrief in question mode when we're preparing for a debrief. We're asking questions instead of doing all of the talking. You position it, and then you have some questions that really identifies their understanding of the link between what they just did and the learning.
Exactly. I think another one is debriefing only at the end of the session. When
Yeah.
we think, that is the time, right? That is the formal moment to do the debrief. And of course, our participants are going to remember everything that we did in that entire session. It was a full day, or even it was just 90 minutes. But truly, we need to debrief at the end of all key critical activities, whether it was a simulation, a role play, a core discussion, a more robust skit-based activity, whatever it is. Those are opportunities to debrief, again, to drive that connection between what they have learned and actually applying it in their world.
Yeah, and manage your time in a debrief. This is a time or not an opportunity to really make an error, which is where you take the debrief too long,
Mm-hmm.
have them talk too much. The three key takeaways or points from the activity linked to the learning, linked to their on at work application, and then move on. So manage your
Exactly.
time with debriefs.
Exactly. I think the key reframe here for us as trainers is to stop thinking of the debrief as the wrap up and think of it as the point, right? The activity is just how we got the room to do something, to practice something, to start building a skill. But the debrief is truly where the magic happens to make sure that all of this hard work translates to their real world.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to tell a quick story about a debrief that I conducted here for actually professional trainers. So this was one of those opportunities I had where I was training trainers, and so you've got the participants that just engaged in a breakout where they were doing coaching, and it was trio groups, and it was a role play. They call it a real play
Hmm.
because they actually use situations from their own work. They're getting ready to coach somebody when they leave the breakout. And so we came out of the room, and it really was well done. Everybody enjoyed it, the way it was laid out and the opportunity. And then it was time to sort of bring everybody together and begin asking those key questions. You center the activity. So this was an activity about learning to become a more effective coach. We had a chance to practice the process for how to coach effectively. And now what we want to do is really understand how we're going to take this to work. So what was one thing you learned from one of your participants in the breakout with you that allowed you to be a better coach? So you may want to have them talk about some of the things that they took away from the partners they had in the room. Another question you may want to ask relates to, so in what ways, one or two ways, are you a better coach as a result of this real play? You can either type or talk, put your answer in chat, or come off mute. Sometimes also as a debrief, you'll ask groups to have a spokesperson, a scribe in the group during the activity, to have insights, takeaways, keynotes that they can come out of the activity and put into chat, or they can verbalize. And it's a nice way for you to use their indication of learnings in their group and bake it into an effective debrief. So, and then you always out of the debrief want to transition to what's coming next. So we
Hmm.
talked about how coaching allows us to help people grow. Let's next talk about ways in which we can handle challenging conversations in our coaching conversation. You shift to the next piece and transition effectively.
I love it. I definitely appreciate the example of doing debriefs well. I can give an example of doing debriefs not so well. I know that no other trainer has experienced this, but just to exemplify it. So a few years ago, I was delivering a training around coaching and leadership, and we did this really robust activity where we had to build skits of the different leadership concepts and core principles around leadership, broke the teams into or broke the group into different teams, and they had 10 minutes to build these really fantastic skits. They had to include prompts and they had to include items, objects, whatever they could find in the training room. And the team with the most dramatic skit would win a prize at the end. Then, of course, they ran the skits, and everyone was really engaged. They had a lot of fun with it. They were saying, "Yes, I can relate to this. Yes, that was really great. That was a very dramatic skit. I vote for this particular team." And at the end, I realized, uh-oh, we are out of time. We have to run. We have to move on to the next section of the training. And so I started to move on. And I had one participant say, "Karie, sorry to interrupt you, but I just don't get it. Why did we do those skits? We don't act in our roles as managers. Like, why did you have us do these skits?" And I realized, whoops, I skipped a very important, very critical element of what should be honestly considered as part of the activity itself, the debrief. And so I said, okay, let's slow down. Let's discuss why do we think we did we did this? How does it relate to us being more effective managers? When are we called to these kinds of situations? And we did a more robust debrief. And then at that point, it was basically that I had the permission as a facilitator to move on to the next section of the training.
That's right. I like to call it earn the right to move on.
Earn the right to move on. I love it. So let's make this really real. What are some tools and frameworks that we could use? I think some key things to think about is first and foremost, when do we debrief, right? We already talked about the trap earlier of just debriefing at the very end of the session, considering it as a wrap up of the session. When else do you think, Charles, we should debrief in a session?
Yeah, when we're asking them to use a tool and apply it, then it's time after that activity where they're using something to debrief their application of the tool, maybe position it so that they can visualize themselves using it on their day-to-day job. And that's the purpose of the debrief after something like that. Or
Mhm.
even sometimes after a discussion that surfaced disagreement or tension. It's a good opportunity to do that because you don't want to leave things unresolved. And in a debrief, it gives you the opportunity to bring it to resolution so people feel comfortable with the outcome of the discussion.
Exactly, exactly. Very much agree with those. I would also add after any role play, any simulation, any skit, like I mentioned earlier, right? Any time that there's some kind of learning friction is how I think about it, right? They did some kind of more intense interaction with the concepts, with the skills that they're building. That is the time to make sure that we're debriefing again so that they realize, where can I apply this in my real world? I think some areas where we don't necessarily have to debrief are, quick energizers, or we get people to stand to talk to a partner. All of those, that's part of the flow of the session. Not necessarily, we don't necessarily have to ask the question, now, why do you think we stood and talked with a partner? I think that's a little
Well,
bit of overkill.
those are great insights. When shouldn't we use it? And again, it's so important for you when you prep that you also prep for when to use debriefs. Make that as important as any other piece in the training in your preparation.
Exactly. Including essentially what questions do we ask, or what's a framework that we could leverage when we are debriefing? Because oftentimes we find ourselves in those moments of, oh, I should debrief right now. And then
Mhm.
we don't have that pre-prepared question, right? We can use a simple framework that can help us in those moments. It's the very simple what, so what, and now what framework. So what can look like, so what did you notice happened? More of a broad question, right? And I like, Charles, how you mentioned earlier with your example of a good debrief. How does this help us to be stronger X, right? Whatever the training is about, whether it's leaders, whether it's coaches, whether it's sales reps, how does this that we just practice help us to be stronger, and then working towards that ultimate vision that we have? What does the so what look like?
Well, you've got to really indicate why this, or pull from people why this matters.
Mhm.
What does it connect to in terms of application on the job? The so what is, why am I going to be a better professional as a result of what this is?
Exactly. It's that insight again, that bridge into, so what am I going to do with this? Which is getting into that now what? So what action will I take? We can go a little bit further here and make this really real, right? The key is to make it really tangible for our participants. So again, by asking questions, things like what will you do differently because of this, but going even deeper, when's your next opportunity to coach one of your team members? What will that look like? Who is that team member? How might they react? What resistance might they show? And how could we navigate through that resistance, right? The more real we make it, the more prepared they will be when they get to that moment.
Yeah, take that now what to a different, deeper level. Questions like, what was your aha moment, or what's your takeaway? It really needs to be taken deeper. What am I
Mhm.
going to do different, better? as a result of what we just did and take it in that direction.
Exactly, exactly. Basically, helping them to build that new future for themselves. And I think most trainers tend to jump into that. So, what does this mean? And skip the what happened entirely. But what is that the value of settling for a moment in that what happened or the what stage of the debrief?
Yeah. Yeah, and be sure to use follow-up questions. When they actually acknowledge that they are going to do something different, better, reward that,
Hmm.
and just ask them to be more specific, so that we can really visualize them using the new skill or being confident in its use in a big way.
Exactly. They might say, "Yeah, I'll use this process in my next coaching conversation with my team member." Then we
Yeah.
can dig and say, "Who might that don't no names, but who might that team member be? When might that conversation be?" Right? We keep it light with that might. When might that conversation be? What could that look like? And that helps them again to paint that picture even more. It helps the other participants to truly paint that picture for themselves too, because they're asking those same questions of themselves as they're hearing it from their fellow participant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we boil it down to a handful of principles, I think some principles, key ones that I tend to try to keep in mind for these debriefs are first and foremost, ask before you tell. I think, Charles, we are very much aligned with this one, but let
We
the
are.
room surface the insights, right? It's up to
Yep.
them to do the work. It's our job to facilitate by asking those questions.
And because they're thoughtful questions, the immediate response you might get is silence. And
Hmm.
that's because they're thinking of their answer. Let them do that. Let silence do the heavy lifting,
Hmm.
before you jump in and comment to what they're saying.
Exactly, exactly. I think another one is debrief the pattern, not just the moment, right? Not just, so what did we do here? Why did we do this? But truly, what is the pattern behind this? How does this connect to the challenges that we have in our roles in the real world? What patterns do we see? What connections do we see? And therefore, what should we do differently in the real world?
Yeah. Sometimes I like to let them know what the debrief questions are before they go into the activity. I'd
Hmm.
like you to consider these questions as you're finishing up the activity, because this is what we'll be talking about when we come back. It gives them a connection while they're doing the activity and some consideration there, so that you could have a really good discussion coming out.
Love it. It sets up, in a sense, the why behind the activity, and then we come full circle, which adult learners tend to like to come full circle. They feel complete at that point, and they tend to understand that why did we do this? Oh, I see why we did this. We came full circle. Okay, great. I'm ready to move on now.
Right, right. Yeah, and make sure that you avoid, just generic comments like I said before. What's your takeaway? Have people really bring their real situations out. It
Hmm.
takes the debrief to a deeper level for everybody. They just practice
Exactly.
coaching. You might want to ask, who will you coach? When? What did you learn from this that's going to allow you to coach more effectively with this person?
And I think my main thing that I try to keep in mind is create friction, right? Make it really real for them so that they interact with the learning. They're not just passively absorbing information that we are giving them, but they're actively building that information together. And that creates the friction that helps to create that translation to application outside of the training room.
Oh, yeah.
So I think these are a lot of principles, a lot to keep in mind. If we boil it down to just maybe three takeaways for our trainers to keep in mind, there, of course, are many more on our website. Feel free to take a look at our playbook on our website where you can find tons of additional resources. But if you want to boil it down to three concrete things to keep in mind when it comes to debriefing in your sessions, remember that the activity creates the experience. The debrief creates the learning and that translation. We don't want to skip that step because it does the actual work of translating what they did to true application. Use the sequence of what, so what, and now what. Because debriefs often fail because we're skipping one or multiple of these steps. And then remember, if we're out of time, protect the debrief, right? We can cut a little bit from the activity because the true focus, the true thing that we're trying to achieve is actual application outside of the training. So at least ask one question from each of those stages of what, so what, and now what, and that will help to drive that application more.
Let's jump into some takeaways from this learning for us. Just remember the activity creates the experience and the debrief creates the learning. So most debriefs fail because they skip straight to the so what. So it's important that we keep that intact.
Exactly. I think overall, as we're thinking about our next session for everyone, just keep this in mind. The next time you plan a session, don't just ask yourself, what's the activity? Ask, what am I going to ask them to do afterward? If you don't have an answer to that yet, you don't have a finished activity. You have half of one. So before your next session, pick one activity for your that's on your agenda. Think about, how am I going to actively, proactively debrief this so that I can drive that application outside of the session.
When you have the opportunity, make a comment on the podcast to let us know how this applied to something that you were delivering and the effect it had on your ability to really lead a good debrief.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, for our Let's Skill Up Trainer Table podcast on Debrief. We will see you next time.